Hello again.
Hi Mark.
How you doing, Brian?
I'm good. Good to be back after a few weeks off.
Yes, certainly. Have you enjoyed your break?
Yeah, it's been good. It's just busy with working. Good coming out of lockdown now and things getting back to a little bit of normality. So.
Well, that's the hope, isn't it? And hopefully we can kind of... it's a strange old time, isn't it? Even though we're coming out of lockdown, still everybody's at different stages with it, I think. And but yeah, I agree. It's nice to try and see that light at the end of the tunnel. I think I'm starting to believe again.
Yeah, definitely. I've it's been funny missing doing some recordings for a few weeks, having that break. I've definitely missed sitting down and sort of having the chats that we have during the podcasts.
I agree completely, yeah. And I have missed the shed.
Yeah.
I must say, I have missed the shed. I managed to get away, a little bit of a getaway for a couple of days down on the coast of Wales there. And even though we were fortunate with the weather and the sun was shining, there's some glorious kind of scenery.
Wasn't quite like the shed.
It wasn't quite like the shed. I'm not joking when I say that. I was sitting there thinking, I do miss the tranquility of that shed.
Well, I've been able to spend a lot of time still in here because this is where I work and do.
Oh well, bully for you then.
And yeah, it's good to have people back listening to us. We've had some really good feedback from the first series, which has been really good, and obviously that's what motivated us to do the second series. But this time we've introduced some guests into the shed.
Yes, and I am very much looking forward to that, having guests on, and we've been very, very lucky as well because we've had obviously people who've been listening to the podcast and shared it wider. We are very, very grateful for that, but also some people we know in the world of therapy and mental health have been very kind and complimentary. So we basically said to them, right, well, you need to come on and do an episode then.
Yeah.
And that's what we've been lucky. We've got several guests booked in for episodes in this series for in all different areas of mental health, really.
Yeah, I think it'll definitely help give us a bit more in-depth knowledge into specific areas, and with a lot of them, we'll probably find that we have to do numerous episodes on them because they're all in their own right big subjects to cover.
Yeah.
So the idea is for each one that we're going to be having in this series is to sort of almost just do a bit of an overview for people to help them get a bit more of an understanding of the different types of therapy and different issues that people present with.
Definitely, yeah. And of course for ourselves, I learned from these podcasts, from yourself anyway, but and certainly now getting guests on, yeah, I am really excited about it. So who's our first guest?
It's our good friend Paul Nairn, counsellor, trauma therapist.
Yeah. I'm well excited, yeah, I am as well. And as you say, he is a good friend of ours, but he's in my opinion, he's a wealth of knowledge, particularly around mental health, but particularly around trauma. So yeah, I'm well looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, no pressure.
I hope he doesn't walk out if I ask him too many questions. So yeah, hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, my name is Mark.
Hi, I'm Brian, and welcome to the Therapy Shed podcast.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing good, thanks, yeah.
Good.
I'm doing dandy-o.
Good.
How's your good self?
Yeah, good. Looking forward to today's episode. It's first time we've had an extra person in the therapy shed.
Yeah.
A new dynamic.
A new dynamic indeed, and one that I'm well excited about.
Definitely.
So without further ado, most importantly, welcome to Mr. Paul Nairn.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for the big build-up as well. That's no pressure here. No pressure.
No pressure at all.
There's no pressure in this shed anyways. It's so laid back. It's lovely.
Yeah, it's good.
It is. Do you liking being in the shed?
Yeah. Thanks for letting me into your space. It's really good. Really nice. Really chill. Looking forward to the episode. Looking forward to sharing knowledge together.
Me too. I think it's something that we've spoke a lot about, haven't we? You know, between ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, trauma's a big subject. Today we're not going to cover everything around trauma. It'll take about, I think we could do a whole series on just trauma, couldn't we?
Yeah, I think it's tying it together and trying to make it just bite-sized, just to kind of just give people a taste of what's out there and what we work with as well.
Definitely.
Certainly, yeah. And as you say, it's such a big area of mental health, isn't it? I think trauma's a word that is in like everyday vocabulary, isn't it? You know, we've heard that so many times, like, I feel traumatised, that thing traumatised me. So I think this would be good certainly for myself. As I say, I'm really excited to pick your brains, Paul, but also hopefully for everyone listening as well, just to get a bit more kind of just a bit more knowledge, I suppose, a bit more understanding around what that actually means when we say we feel traumatised, or what that term means in different contexts as well.
Yeah, because it can be a term that gets thrown around, doesn't it? When you're working with clients, sometimes they come in and someone says I'm depressed or I've got OCD. They're just words that are bandied around now, but kind of giving a better definition of what trauma really is today. Because some people might minimise what they're going through. Some people who listen today actually think, oh, it's not trauma, you should just be getting on with it. But actually this might give them a bit of a definition to say, actually I've gone through something.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, isn't it? Because I think with trauma, a lot of people maybe see trauma as, this massive event that's happened, and sometimes, which we'll get a bit more into in the episode, but sometimes trauma can be things that people don't realise can count or class as trauma.
Yeah.
Which is something that hopefully we can get across in this episode. But just before we get into actually talking about trauma, not to put any more pressure on you, Paul, but Mark's got a few little questions, get to know your questions, I suppose.
Therapy shed questions, let's have it.
Therapy shed questions, that will be what they are known as from this point forward. Indeed, so as we did in our first series, we asked each other, Brian and I asked each other these questions. So in this series we're going to ask each of our guests, and you are the lucky winner who gets to answer them first.
First on.
Okay. So 10 questions, Paul, and it's just hopefully getting to know you a little bit more. And we said in the first series, didn't we, these questions are we found them interesting in that your answers could change each and every day with these questions. There may be questions that are less conventional and like, what's your favourite colour sort of thing. So
I think I compared them to when people come in for therapy and we do sort of ROMs with them and things like that. Obviously it's a way of us gauging where the clients are on that particular day. For me, those questions felt very similar, because I got asked them the first week, and then the second week I asked them to Mark, and while I was thinking of my answers, I knew they were different from the previous ones. So it's quite interesting. And yeah, I think interested to see what some of the answers will be.
Yeah.
Yes. Are you ready, Paul?
Oh yes, come on.
Okay.
Spotlight.
So, without further ado, lights down. Question number 1. What is your favourite word?
And actually it's really interesting Brian saying that, because I remember this one from the first podcast, and in the car coming down, it was dad, but it's changed.
Okay.
Even as I got here, it's present. I think that's my favourite word.
Present.
Yeah. There was something about dad for me at first, because that's really important, being a dad. It reminds me who I am and what I can be, but actually present, because it's really important to be present. Really important just to be here right now. Not in the gym where I'm going to be, not on where I was this morning, actually here right now. And that's really important.
Right, these answers are already well better than ours.
Boss
That's amazing. Thank you very much, Paul. That was brilliant. Okay, question number 2. What is your least favourite word?
I just laugh at that. The way it can't. And I think that's for me, not for like my clients or whatever. Can't means, quite often that I won't. Definitely.
I think that was my fear. I think that
It
was.
was, yeah. That was Brian's answer as well.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I think for a similar type of of reason, yeah.
Because there's a sense of like, I can't do that, it just means I haven't got a willingness to do it. Yeah, but there's just that kind of just taking that extra frame, that next step into life, and just there's just something about that. Especially with trauma work, there's that stop, I can't, and actually, if you just take that next frame, what's the next picture look like, and that gets something moving, and just willing to take that step means a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
I could go off waffling here, lads, so just
Waffle as much as you like. I feel like a toddler on like my granddad's knee. You know what I mean? Like, oh, this is amazing.
I'm not that old.
No, I didn't mean in that. No, waffle as much as you like, please. Question number 3: what turns you on?
Well, there's a few ways you can answer this question, but I'll frame it a different way. Seeing people grow, just seeing people change, and grow into what they can be. Definitely. Mental health, I used to teach martial arts. Mental health, martial arts, just seeing people grow into something different. And start realising the potential, that's kind of just what it's all about for me.
Like becoming as a person? Yeah,
just seeing people kind of coming in crushed and just coming out of whatever they've been through, whether bullying, violence, I'm linking this to martial arts, linking it to mental health, because those two are very closely connected for me. But just seeing people grow, becoming themselves.
It's funny when you say that, the image I get is like it's that sort of flower image, isn't it, of sort of nature and that flower watering it and just letting it grow, and if you give it the space to grow, and it'll just grow, and
it's all about the environment, isn't it? Definitely.
Okay. Question number 4: what turns you off?
It's the opposite to seeing people grow. It's people who think they've got it's kind of that, it's okay to be confident, but arrogant where they just kind of I try not to swear that much, but it's like somebody said to me a while back, it's like playing chess with a pigeon. You can have all the great moves, but the pigeon will just kick all the chess pieces off and shit on the board. They just won't engage with you.
I love that analogy.
I love that. A client said that to me a while back. It had me in stitches, but it's such a good analogy.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I'm going to say,
arrogance was mine.
Was it? Wow. And there's that Bruce Lee quote, isn't it? Those who are most full of self are most empty, which I love.
Yeah, I love that quote as well.
Funny, we've got the same answers. I can copy.
You sure? Copy my answers.
Right. Question number 5: what sound or noise do you love?
It's quite a difficult one because I never really thought about it, but there's something about rain.
Right.
Please don't tell me you got the same answers.
This is not funny anymore. I'll go and put the kettle on, shall I, and just leave you two to get on with it. Brian's answer was rain, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just think like on the last couple of nights where I've just, it's been really hot and the rain's come, just having the window open and just, there's something about that noise that just really grounds you.
Yeah, and I think if I remember rightly, when we recorded this episode, it had been raining the night before when I gave my answers, and I don't know if that's why, but this is getting a bit strange and all that.
It is.
You've either copied all my answers. Whatever your next answer is, change it.
So
amazing.
Question number 6: what sound or noise do you hate?
You won't have this one. Tinnitus. Got really bad tinnitus.
Oh, you suffer from tinnitus?
Yeah, it's all the time. It's kind of. It's all right mostly, but at night time or mornings when there's nothing else. But that's not a noise for everybody. That's a noise for me. You're not going to hear it now. You just kind of just switch it off a bit. But the noise I really hate is crisp packets in the cinema.
Oh yes, that's a very. I completely empathise with you there.
Yeah.
That's a very.
So one we can all have.
Big trigger that for me. Yes,
I agree.
Definitely. Okay. Question number 7: what is your favourite swear word?
This might surprise you because you both heard me swear. Don't really like swearing. Don't really like it.
Do you know what that was? Sorry to interrupt you, but that was my first thought when you said that. I've heard you swear several times, but you're not a big swearing person, I must say.
No.
I wouldn't associate swearing with you at all. But you're going to give us a crack.
But I do swear.
You do swear?
I do swear. But what interests me about swearing is the effect it can have. Have you seen the thing on Netflix? the series on Netflix about swear words.
Yeah,
Nicolas
yeah.
Cage.
Yeah, I mentioned it in the first episode. Yeah.
I'll have to listen a bit more to your podcast.
You haven't listened to this podcast before, have you?
I did listen. And I think there was one where they put the hand in the water, and if you say fuck, it actually takes pain away. It's
I've heard of
interesting.
that experiment
really
before,
interesting,
yeah.
Right.
So I'm interested about what happens when you say something, a specific word. But actually for a favourite one, I haven't really got one.
Okay.
There's some funny ones when other people say them.
Can you give us one or two of them examples?
I just don't like saying them.
Don't like saying them? Okay.
I have to be kind of in the moment to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so is it like an I suppose swearing is quite emotional,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Can
It can be quite an emotional release, can't it?
Yeah, I encourage clients to do it all the time because it kind of brings out a really organic part of themselves that they might not have access to. I may just talk about conditions of worth before. I'm not this, I'm not that if I swear. And maybe I've got some conditions of worth around swearing, but
because really they're just words, aren't they? That's all they are.
Yeah.
It's we give them the power and the meaning to them. Where if you could say any word, and if someone gives it the power, it can become quite offensive to someone.
Yeah.
Because, if you call someone a potato, if they sort of take that word potato, it can make it offensive and make it bad. And
They're social constructs, aren't they, as well?
Yeah.
We agree what they mean. Yeah.
And there's also like getting pissed. If you're pissed off here, it's like that's almost a swear word. But then in America, everyone uses it. It's like it's okay to say it in America, and like their word over there is like fanny. That's for like the backside, isn't it? They have like a fanny pack that they carry around, but here it's a completely different context. So you're right, it's social, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you made me swear a few times now.
I knew we'd get a few out of it. Okay. Okay, question number 8. What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
Yeah, without any hesitation, like full-time martial artist, definitely.
Right, would that be your...
Yeah. Well, I loved it, and I think it's as close to mental health as you can get for me. Because what I was working with martial arts was the core of changing somebody and giving them confidence. And when I quit martial arts, I don't want to go too much into this because I know that there's time limits. When I quit martial arts, I knew that it helped somebody come from really low self-esteem. They walked in looking like they were broken in a session and walked out with their head held up. And thought, I can do this and reach so many people with counselling.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to, of course, have a conversation about your, shall we say, your journey so far, what brought you into the world of therapy in a moment, but would you say that was a key kind of catalyst for you?
Yeah, definitely.
Becoming
because I was teaching and then training to be a counsellor alongside, and I just thought, I can stop this now, I can let it go.
Yeah.
And if the counselling world ended, I knew I could still get that element back by doing martial arts.
Yeah. And there's a lot of self-discipline in martial arts, isn't there, as well? And I guess that's a big part of mental health. That's exploring the self and touching your limitations and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Befriending your body and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and constantly learning as well. You never stop learning.
The eternal students. Same with counselling as we know.
Yeah. Right. So full-time martial artist. Yeah, these answers are miles better than ours.
All the same.
All the same. Yeah. Question number 9. What profession would you definitely not like to attempt?
I wanted to be a policeman when I was younger.
Okay.
And actually that question about what would you like to attempt, it would be the police in some ways, but actually I really wouldn't like to do the treatment to get at the really front line, to getting spat at,
It's a tough job, isn't it?
Yeah, really tough.
It is it can be a very undervalued job as well, sadly. Often, so a police officer would be not your cup of tea.
No, definitely not. I want the patience either.
And finally, question number 10. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say to you when you arrive at the pearly gates?
It's a really interesting question because I guess you both know I was a Christian for a long time.
Yeah.
Like proper, like full on born again Christian for a long time. So there's a kind of that humility and being a bit scared of going to heaven in case, you didn't quite meet the standard. But there was a book I read a while back called I forgot what it's called. It's called The Cabin. The Cabin, and somebody meets God.
Right.
And Jesus just gets side by side with them and just is the friend. So to be met like an old friend, and just to have that walk, that image comes to mind. Just having that walk and just saying, "What was all that about?" Just being met by a friend, I think that's really the image that comes to mind.
What, and reflecting on your life, or?
Yeah, just the key points, you know, just being having that walk. I've got this image of walking through a golden field, just with a friend and just having a chat and just saying, why did this happen, why did that happen, and just kind of just tying up my life a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
So not kind of said, no, well done, or, you know, those kind of things, or you're right, lad. You know, just that sense of being met by somebody who's been there at your side all the time.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's an incredibly, it sounds like an incredibly cathartic sort of, if that's the right word, cathartic sort of experience. That fascinating as well, fascinating imagery there. Okay.
Well, that book, The Cabin, I'll say it really briefly. It's about somebody who loses the daughter. The daughter's murdered in this cabin. This guy goes back to visit. He's really angry with God, and he's met by God, and not by the God of the kind of, we think that, you know, he's a big guy with a white beard in the sky. Somebody's really personable.
Okay.
Sounds like an interesting book.
Yeah, definitely. Got to check that one out.
I feel like that's gone off on another tangent.
Could easily do. Let's bring it right back.
Well, thank you very much for those answers, because honestly, in all sincerity, they were brilliant and really, really fascinating answers, weren't they? You know?
Yeah, and I think when they're more organic, they're definitely. I think sometimes when people have had a lot of time to think about it, they can come up with all weird, wonderful answers, can't they? And a bit like when a client comes in and we go through certain questions with them, and it's just however they're feeling on the day. Like, you know, you could have, maybe something for you to do, Paul, is, you know, in a week or two's time, ask yourself them questions again and see if the answers are the same.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
But that's really the point you just made there, Brian, is really, it comes back to what Paul's, I think, the first question, was it the favourite word? You said it was present, and that's exactly what you're kind of, you know, getting at there, really, isn't it? That sense of answering those questions in a present body and in a present mind. You know, allowing yourself to be sincere in the moment. Fascinating. As you said, this is an episode to get to know Paul, but also get to pick your brains around as an overview of trauma, really, and mental health. So could we just start off, Paul, just to give us a little bit of a background on yourself and what got you into the world of mental health, the world of therapy?
Yeah, if my younger self could see myself now, it'd be really weird, because I was a little bit of a scally in school, did nothing in school, absolutely nothing. I won't go too deeply into it. I'll give you like a kind of just a running view. Didn't even open my exam stuff in school. Thought I'd get nowhere. Anyway, about 20, maybe 30 years ago, but I'm knocking on a bit now, I was depressed. And I went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Oh, you need some counselling." And I actually said to the doctor, swearing appropriately, "It's bullshit." Went to a counsellor, because he sent me to a counsellor. Only had one session. Really turned me thinking around. Kind of opened up the world to therapy for me. It was really interesting.
Okay.
Worked with homeless people, voluntary work. Yes, I used to be really into the church, like some voluntary work with the homeless, and we'd give them breakfast in the morning, and they'd really open up and have a chat, and we'd go back in the night time, and they'd turn to like the drugs and alcohol or whatever, and I'd say, "Are you alright after what we spoke about this morning?" And they'd just be, you know, not in a place to talk or even remember. And I realised I was adding to that. I was opening them up, and they were having to go away and numb that which any other way they could. So I did the level 2 counselling course to be able to shut down conversations. My tutor was really kind. She would say, like, you know, you've got a real national affinity for this. So just carried on training, absolutely fell in love with it. Didn't have any inkling about having a job in counselling. Didn't do it for any money at all. I just loved it. Did some CBT, trained in person-centred counselling, and then did some CBT after that, because I thought we needed something a little bit more robust for anxiety disorders. You know, things around OCD, PTSD. So I had that structure in place, and then started getting little bits of work. At a place called Listen and Ear in Halewood, working with people who are struggling with employment. Volunteered at the university for a bit, University of Liverpool, which is a big learning experience, and then got a job in a young person's charity, where we kind of met. I'd managed a little service for a while as well. And just going along, I'd noticed that, you know, there was a few experiences just thinking about it like, as trauma, as a trauma kind of informed therapist. Just experience of losing people where they just felt like down time holes where I couldn't help them in conversations with counselling, and they just disappear. And I thought, I can't reach them. And it's because we didn't have the right tools at that time, or experience at that time. They just felt like down a time hole into the trauma, and it was all I could do just to pull them back. Quite scary as a young therapist. And then there was the Manchester bombing, and my heart just really went out. And there was a guy advertising on Facebook a memory restructuring intervention. He'd come over from Israel, and he'd had this proven technique to stop PTSD. Wanted volunteer therapists to go down there, so I volunteered to go down there. And the theory behind his, I'll say it really quickly, is you put the places of the trauma in place before they become displaced and become PTSD. It's like almost putting a shattered mirror back together, and sometimes there'll be pieces missing that you can't quite find, but if you put it back together as much as you can, it's not going to come back in flashbacks. So I can go off on a tangent, but I'm not going to. Yeah, so I did that, worked with probably 35, 40 people with this memory restructuring.
Were they survivors of the bombing, were they?
Survivors of the bombing, yeah. So there'd been people who'd seen it, there'd been people who hadn't seen it, there'd been people who'd actually, you know, one person had bumped into the guy, walked past him, and then as he detonated, they were hit with shrapnel.
Right.
So a lot of varied stuff around the bombing. So that was really good, really interesting, the trauma model back then. Then people who did Brainspotting, trainers for Brainspotting in England. Brainspotting has been around for the last couple of years. It's kind of come out of EMDR. They come to Manchester and offered us training at a reduced rate. So I went along and trained in level 1 and 2 for Brainspotting, and worked with a couple of people around the bombing after that, and a couple more people for Brainspotting, and found that really, really useful. Did a bit more training in trauma-informed stuff like the rewind technique, which was amazing, which kind of pushed me towards like EMDR. Like rewind and Brainspotting, it's got a growing evidence base, but it's not kind of in nice guidelines. It's not an approved therapy because it hasn't got all the randomised trials with it. So over the last couple of years, I've trained in EMDR, really robust method of trauma therapy. So I've trained in person-centered CBT. I don't want to sound like I'm being smart.
No, please tell us, because I think it's helpful for us to
counselling for depression, interpersonal psychotherapy. And I think now after doing EMDR, I've stripped everything back to person-centred counselling for depression and EMDR. And now I work in the NHS, and it's a real balanced caseload. Work with a lot of depressed clients, and part of it is working EMDR with traumatised clients.
Can I
quite the journey?
Yeah, it sounds like, which is you know, and again, we could have spent a whole episode of really going into that journey, couldn't we? But I think you know, obviously we're looking at trauma today, but I think it's good to get a bit of an insight and a bit of a background into, you know, how you start off at one place and then ends up at another place. Just for people who are listening, what does EMDR stand for? Eye
movement desensitisation and reprocessing.
Right. Did put you on the spot.
Trying to catch him out there.
Well, I say that to clients as well, and it's like I have to remember it too.
It's quite a long. Each word's quite long, isn't it? Type of thing.
There's a lot of acronyms in mental health as well, isn't there? You know? Can I just ask, Paul? When you started working with the survivors of the Manchester bombing, or you know, treatments of people around in relation to that event, was that the first time you'd really focused on being a trauma therapist?
Yeah, in a structured way, to actually say, we're going to work on this specific trauma, we're going to do this. Worked with some people in the past who had, you know, PTSD and complex PTSD, but really didn't have the tools available. And we find sometimes is that, you know, with all the best intentions as counsellors, we can make it worse sometimes if we don't know what we're doing with it.
Absolutely,
And there's so many stories of people going for counselling and being opened up, and the counsellor not being able to close that off, not being able to tune, not being able to kind of just boundary that. And that's through no no fault of their own.
It's not ill-intentioned, is it?
Yeah, it needs to be in the training, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Right, okay. Yeah. I mean, I suppose in some ways you could say that applies to kind of everyday life as well, doesn't it? Like we had an episode in the first series, all available online for free. Cheeky plug there, but I know in all seriousness, we had a conversation in one of our episodes in the first series about the difference between a trained therapist and people in your personal life who love you and want to protect you and care for you and rescue you maybe. And that was one of the themes that we kind of, I think it's such an important point that you're making there, Paul. That sense of it's not ill-intentioned. People want to rescue, they want to fix other people. And I was just wondering for yourself there, particularly with such a kind of high-profile event in the public consciousness, shall we say, in terms of the Manchester bombing. But when you're working with survivors of that, did you feel at any point like the rescuer in you was coming up, like you wanted to fix people, or were you very were you able to manage that in yourself? The kind of remaining professional and treating the trauma rather than the.
It does. It's a very good point. With up to before the point, but when it's an acute stress disorder, when it's a normal response to a stressful event, you're best staying cognitive. It was really difficult because what you want to do is empathise with people. So when somebody is traumatised, they are stuck in the lower part of the brain, like the limbic system. That's where all the emotions are going on, but what you want to do is pull them into the cognitive. This was the theory behind it. And they showed a video of a bombing in Israel, and one lady being told, get moving, keep going, being given a command, being pulled into the prefrontal cortex, given a command, taking some control. And then the next lady, somebody just touched her on the arm and said, it's okay, don't be scared, I'm with you, and she collapsed because they were taking her deeper into the trauma. So it was a really good learning point.
Wow,
that you don't want to rescue them and pull them deeper into the emotional brain. You need to just do the intervention and say, okay, there was a bang, okay, what was that bang? Well, it was somebody blowing himself up. Okay, so the bang was somebody blowing himself up, and it sounds really harsh.
You take the emotion out of it in many ways, yeah.
Because later on down the line, a bang to them could be somebody blowing himself up if it gets lost in that kind of the limbic system.
Yeah.
But actually doing that and tying it together later on when they hear a bang, it's not that. That's a car door.
So the bang just becomes an association if it's not processed in what that bang is a different bang from other bangs that you might see.
Because what happens in the brain with trauma, I'm probably going a little bit too deep into it at this point maybe, is the hippocampus normally files your memories. So when we're talking now, the hippocampus is doing its work and it's filing the memory, but actually in trauma the hippocampus doesn't do that. It provides cortisol to the body, so it shuts down for a bit, so it's not filing the memory, and that's why it gets stuck. That's why that bang will become later on down the line. The hippocampus will remember that, send a signal to the amygdala and flood your body with that kind of that stress hormone.
It's a stress hormone,
it's still stuck there, and it's not filed, that memory.
Right. Yeah.
So the pre-PTSD intervention was to do that, to help file the memory.
And I think like you said about sort of somebody going into therapy with a therapist who maybe is not trained around trauma and that sort of re-traumatisation and things like that. I definitely agree that it should be taught, that there should be at least one model that's taught to all counsellors about how to at least avoid re-traumatisation. I know in CBT you do a little bit of that, but I can't remember when I done my counselling training if I learned that. That's something I've learned later on when I've done trauma work and different models, and it could be because tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of it is at a very basic level. When you first start working with trauma, it's about safety and grounding before you get into the trauma work. So if somebody come into therapy with trauma and the therapist knows to just, rather than open up that trauma, to just get that person at a point where they feel safe within themselves and grounded, then that just avoids the re-traumatisation.
Yeah, definitely, because they come in with that head and heart thing, don't they? They come in, shouldn't be feeling this way, this doesn't make sense, I'm safe, but the body's trying to save them, the body's giving them all that other stuff, and actually befriending the body by doing loads of grounding, as you say, Brian. Yeah, I think that's a great way to start.
And I think a really good book that I started, what got me interested in trauma, was The Body Keeps the Score, which a lot of that is about, isn't it? How the body reacts to the brain and trauma. And even saying that, then I was aware saying how the body reacts to the brain, but the one thing, it's one entity, isn't it? They're not, the brain and body aren't two different things, and that's what then got me more interested in trauma. I haven't done EMDR yet, but I plan on doing it when the opportunity arises very soon, hopefully. But I do bits of work around trauma. But a lot of the work I do is around that safety and grounding element of it. Yeah.
And we'll definitely get into that conversation today with Paul around the different treatments. We've mentioned EMDR, and you mentioned before Brainspotting and the rewind technique as well. So I think it'd be good for us to just have a little chat about that, and what that does, if you like, and what that's suitable for. But I just thought if we can, before we get into kind of the different treatment modalities, shall we say, you mentioned before, Paul, around, or we were talking at the beginning of the episode around the kind of vocabulary of trauma and the everyday vocabulary. And I've certainly said it hundreds of times in my life. I was traumatised, that was a traumatic event, or whether I've said it in jest or in sincerity, but when we say what is trauma, I guess, how is trauma defined like now, and how's it changed? Do you have any what's your understanding of that, how the definition of trauma has changed over time?
It's a massive question, isn't it? It's a massive question.
It is.
I just think that for me, I would define trauma to a client is that it's a normal response to a traumatic event. I think we've got much more understanding of it now. I think we've had conversations before about what it used to be. It used to be called hysteria, didn't it? We spoke about this before. Yeah.
I think it was often seen as only women experienced what we now understand as trauma. Hysteria was like, you're being hysterical, and it was a very sexist sort of.
Yeah, because the men would be for the men it would be shell shock, wouldn't it? It would only be acceptable come back from more shell shock. So that's quite.
Because I think that was, I know it was used in like the world, like World War I and II, sort of shell shock and things. But I think PTSD didn't really start getting looked at until it was like the Vietnam War, wasn't it? In America, that's when they started taking a look at what was happening to these young lads going away and witnessing, experiencing these things. But yeah, prior to that, it was just shell shock, which is now we know is PTSD.
So what's the difference between PTSD and trauma? What would you say the key kind of? How would you kind of? I'm not saying you diagnose them, but how would you recognise them as different things? What turns trauma into PTSD?
Well, there would be a diagnostic criteria, definitely. The DSM-5, and you've mentioned it before in your podcast. It's looking at that criteria. It's about symptoms that last persistently for a month. So after the Manchester bombing, if you look at that for an example, what happens is the body floods you with everything you need for that traumatic event, fight, flight. Over the next couple of days, as the hippocampus does its work, that kind of gets filed, that gets moved, and you start to flush those things out. So for the first 30 days, you've got an acute stress response, and that's just normal. That would be normal, acute stress response. Up to 6 months, it's post-traumatic stress, where actually there's something else maybe needs doing with it. But actually, with the D on the end, post-traumatic stress disorder, is when it becomes something else. It's when it becomes intrusive. There's 4 criteria for PTSD. Intrusive thoughts and memories and flashbacks. Things that are pushing in when you don't want them to. It's almost like you're thinking about something today. When you start processing something, I'm going to the shop, I need my keys, I need my phone, I need my wallet. Your brain will say, you're processing stuff, and it's almost like things going into a conveyor belt, you're filing it away, and your brain's going, you're processing something, and it throws a memory on because I want to process that. That's what the brain's trying to do. That's the first one, flashbacks. Then there's avoidance of feelings, somatic feelings, things that remind you of events or places or people. And then there's negative thoughts of feelings about yourself, fear, shame, anger, jumpiness. And then reactive symptoms, kind of being irritable, more irritable than usual.
Right, okay.
So those things that are quite stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of, I'd imagine those symptoms that you've just mentioned, when an event first takes place, that's when they're normal, because the body and brain processing it and doing what it needs to do to help process what's happened, help make sense of what's happened. It's when those symptoms persist or become worse. That's when it becomes more, obviously looking at.
I think that's when it's a disorder then, isn't it? Yeah. They say as you,
it's disturbing your sleep, it's disturbing your relationships, it's disturbing your ability to be present. Yeah. There's that word again.
Yeah.
And I think I think that when it's coming back that far down the line and it's disrupting your day, and that when a colour or a smell or a noise just takes you right back to that moment and you're feeling everything in that moment again, you're reliving again, that's the difference.
Don't quote me on this, but I think it's when you mention the DSM-5, I think the diagnostic criteria for PTSD is if it's 3 months after after the event, if you're still experiencing all those symptoms you're describing, that's when it could be like diagnosed as a disorder then, as opposed to experiencing a traumatic event.
And maybe there's a crossover, because I think for NHS guidelines it has to be 6 months after that diagnosis.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess something I was thinking of when I was asking that question before was, for myself, and I suppose maybe for people listening as well, how would you say, what was the difference between having negative memories, shall we say, memories of things that we didn't like or we class as bad experiences, negative experiences, and that kind of a traumatic event? Do you know what I mean? Is there a way that you could answer that, or is that a very case by case?
I think the difference is that we all have things that have gone on that we don't like, but these are intrusive things that we don't want to be thinking about, that come back for no good reason.
Right.
They just push into our consciousness. Somebody's been abused when they were a child, sexual encounters later on in life, when somebody touches them, they're taken back to that moment. It's intrusive. It's not just an unpleasant thought. Okay. Because lots of people are abused, sadly. But not everybody's left with PTSD. But for some people it gets stuck. And that and gets stuck for different reasons. But that's the difference. When they don't want to think about it, it comes back.
Right.
Holding hands with the partner takes them back to that adult that abused them. Those kind of things that aren't quite normal. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you for that. That really does make sense. I think, certainly for myself, and I say hopefully for anyone listening, I think that's a lot of clarity there between, that's the difference between a painful past event that's got negative emotions attached to, if you like, a negative experience, and a trauma, like capital T trauma.
Anything that pushes into the now, and again, the present again, anything that pushes into the now, when the past is intruding in the present and it actually feels like it's happening. Yeah, that's a really important.
It's like, it comes back to what Brian and yourself were saying before about where the body starts reacting as though the trauma is being experienced. You're in a an actual threat situation, and the body reacts.
And it's an amazing system, isn't it? Because your body's trying to look after yourself.
Yeah.
Wants to give you everything you need for that moment, because I don't know whether you've spoken about it before in different podcasts. In your thinking brain, we're here today, we're in the therapy shed, it's lovely, it's chilled out. We're two great fellas. But actually, when a trauma happens, the older brain hasn't got a timeline. If they were here now and they heard something or smelled something that reminded them of a traumatic event, the old brain hasn't got a timeline, thinks it's in that moment rather than the shed today. Okay. It's back in that moment and gives you everything you need for that moment.
Yeah. So it reacts to that moment rather than the present.
Yeah. Because the old brain's faster than our thinking brain. It responds much quicker.
It's much more powerful and faster as well. We mentioned this book in a previous episode, didn't we? The chimp paradox. I don't know if you know that. The sports kind of psychologist, Steve Peters, and he talks quite specifically about that. The idea of fighting with your old brain will never work. You don't fight with it. You try and build a relationship with it and work with it. And as you say, like in the case of trauma, process those those traumatic memories or events. So he says if you fight with the limbic system, you will definitely lose. It's faster and it's far more powerful than the thinking brain.
It's very instinctive, isn't it? That's it by design. It's quite instinctive, so it doesn't have. It's almost that fast. It doesn't have time to think because it just has to react. Very instinctive because it's about keeping yourself safe, isn't it? Yeah. Ultimately, that's its job. I'm not
an expert in the brain, but I know bits and bobs. When something comes in, when we hear something, it goes to the thalamus, and that decides, what's that about? Where does that need to go? And if you haven't worked on PTSD, it sends the signal straight to the amygdala. You know, I've heard that car door. I was in Vietnam. I heard the gun go off. That car door sounds like a gun. I'll send this message to the amygdala. We're in danger. And it gives you everything you need in your body. But actually, what happens? That's a split second. It doesn't even think about just boom. Just happens, and it's great, isn't it? If you need it. Because if he is getting shot at, you need to get down.
That's it. Yeah, it's the protection.
So once you work and you bring that, you disconnect that normal response. It goes to the thalamus and then goes to the prefrontal cortex. It's not a bullet. It's the door.
Absolutely. Something before we get onto the because as you say, we could go off on a million tangents. I'm really loving this conversation. But before we get onto the talk about the different treatments for trauma, like as we mentioned, EMDR and Brainspotting and the rewind technique and so on, which we'll come on to in a moment. But I just wanted to ask you, if it's okay, around the vicarious trauma and the area and the, I suppose, treatments of vicarious trauma, or how that's different. Because something that comes to mind when I was listening to you talking then, Paul, was there was a key study that was done, I think it was done in the States back in the late 80s, that was kind of pivotal, I think, for trauma as an area of mental health. You know, trauma as an overall kind of, as a body, if you like, and it was, I forget the researchers now, so forgive me, but it was done in the late 80s, and it was basically that vicarious trauma actually can be just as powerful as experiencing the events. What these researchers proved, or basically, you know, explored and provided a lot of evidence for, was that if you watch a movie and you're really scared by something that happened in the movie, I'm sure it's something we can all relate to, where all of a sudden you're like, I'm scared to go out to my car in the dark now because I just watched a movie. That, you know, and that's like vicarious trauma, isn't it? That's an example of vicarious trauma. And this study was quite extensive, and basically what they said was the world is actually becoming, in most parts of the world, far more safer than it has been in you know, recorded history, and yet we're actually becoming more scared of everyday things more and more. We're more anxious than we've ever been in many ways in everyday life. And they said, and a lot of that is due to vicarious trauma. We're stimulated by movies and the media a lot more. You know, we're more connected, which obviously means that, and particularly nowadays, I guess, with social media, that's been amplified even more, hasn't it? You know, so I guess what I want to ask you is, what's your insight on that, like experiencing vicarious trauma, and can you be traumatized by, in the same, is it a different type of trauma, or can you be traumatized similarly to actually experiencing an event, or if you witness an event?
I think it's just really interesting what you said, Mark, about how exposed we are now. I think when I was a kid, you know, 52, when I was a kid, you got the news at 10 o'clock, and it was just like they'd have a nice little, they'd show you the news and then there'd be a little bit of a nice story at the end, but we're saturated now. Every little thing is like, you know, it pops up on Facebook and it stresses you out. Somebody who's miles away who has a fight in a supermarket, you know, it's big news now, so we're getting it all the time. Yeah, and there's a new part in the DSM-5, the last one that came out, to show that you can get PTSD by constantly witnessing things that you don't want to witness. And there's going to be a lot of NHS staff coming through with PTSD because you've had to live with this day by day. Not something that they want to be going, you know, they love the jobs, but constantly being shown things that they don't want to see. And it can happen in counselling as well. You know, I'm guessing you've experienced it yourselves, you know, we have supervision, but there's a lot of things that we have to hold, a lot of difficult things that we have to hold and work with.
Yeah, definitely.
And the vicarious trauma, I think that, I think I've lost your question now a little bit, but yeah, it's the same thing.
So you can actually be traumatised.
Yeah,
to use that word, to be traumatised by witnessing of it. I mean, that example as well.
Because even like, just to jump in, Because even like with Manchester, with working so many people, I worked with somebody recently doing EMDR. You know, Manchester's probably 3 or 4 years ago now.
Yeah.
Because I've worked with so many people, I was feeling a bit traumatised by it. Because you reliving. You know, I can, you know, it's horrible to say, but I can smell something. Okay, what's that smell? Somebody on fire. I can hear a bang. You know, somebody pushed the door up and got a blast in the face. So holding all of those things, and even thinking about it now, I can feel a little bit stress reaction coming up. But it's about that self-care, isn't it? It's about that knowing when it's time to get off and say, actually, I need to just disconnect a bit.
It's that self-awareness, isn't it? I think, which is what, as therapists, that, you know, it's always a good habit to get into around sort of self-care and that reflection and just self-awareness around sort of what you're dealing with and carrying. I think just about the vicarious trauma, that's obviously why on sort of movies certainly, and I think it was a lot easier when you used to get DVDs and videos, because they'd come with obviously a rating, didn't they, if you know 15, 18, because if you're a 10, 11 year old watching a film that's for an 18-year-old with maybe lots of violence in, or horror, or you know, whatever, at that age your brain's not quite developed enough to be able to understand what they're seeing, and that's where then the trauma can then come into it, can't it? But I think now, again, you know, it's a lot harder to monitor what you're going to watch, whether that be something on Netflix or you know, just on the telly. It doesn't come with those ratings of like 15, 18 type of thing. And even talking about like the news, I've noticed over the last couple of years now, they show more and more explicit images, don't they? So you'll see like dead bodies and you know, if there's been, where I'm thinking back a few years ago, you didn't see that as much, where you see more, you're exposed to more extreme images and sort of things, and as you say, you know, people have phones now, so when an event's happening, if it's a fight, it's often videoed and then sent round, and sometimes you don't even choose whether you see it or not. You can just click on something and you the next minute you're watching it. There's no, I know certain videos might come up with a warning, you know, graphic content and stuff, but a lot don't.
You have such an invasive experience. I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. We have such an invasive experience of a fight, to use that example, as well as it's invading our world, if you like, and breaking our boundaries down by popping up on, you know, a social media feed or whatever. You actually have an invasive experience of the fight, to use that example, because, as you say, it can be recorded. If it's something on the news, it's likely going to be on social media and a lot of different kind of modes of recording as well. So it's just all those boundaries have kind of been really, at best they've become porous, but often they've just completely been broken down with the you know, the explosion of social media, haven't they? You know what I mean? So
definitely there's the big events, isn't there? There's, you know, there's car crashes, there's fires, those big events that we call big T traumas. There's small T traumas that happen to us continually, and then there's these kind of invasives, and that porous word's really good. You know, it just keeps on hitting us, and we have to just soak it up.
And people don't realise, do they? I think, you know, if you're constantly exposed to those smaller things every day, they don't necessarily realise the impact that it could be having long term if you're not processing that or dealing with that. And that sort of, you know, it's almost unnoticeable, really, isn't it, until it gets to a point where your brain just thinking, I can't make sense of this.
And then there's those stuff in childhood that we haven't even spoke about yet, that complex PTSD, where there's the relational trauma, where they're getting trauma from caregivers constantly, and they just soak that up, and then in adulthood it kind of comes out in a much different way. You have to work with that in a different way than a single event trauma. It's fascinating, as you can tell. I love it.
And like we said at the beginning, you know, we could pick out one small part of what we're talking about today and spend a 3-hour episode on it, because it's that big. I mean, what the idea of today is hopefully is to try and give a bit of an overview and to let people know who are listening, who maybe feel like they've experienced some trauma. And this is a question to follow on from this, but that you know, one, it's normal, although it might not feel normal. It is normal to be experiencing these symptoms, or, you know, however you're feeling. And two, there's things that can be done, you know, to help that.
I think it's what Paul said, but just off the back of what you're saying there, Bright, I think what Paul said before, it's I think that can be an invaluable thing to remind ourselves of. And as you say, if anybody's listening who maybe is having or has had a similar experience, it's the body's way of trying to keep you safe. You know, it really is. So it's not an abnormal thing, although it can be, although it can be a terrifying experience when you feel traumatized. It is the body's designed to keep us safe first and foremost, and that is often, if I'm understanding what you're saying, right, Paul, that's often what's happening with experiencing trauma is your body's trying to actually keep you alive.
Yeah, and actually people coming into therapy, just normalising that, a bit of education around that this is normal, your body's trying to look after itself, and it takes away a lot of that shame. Because everybody, we spoke about friends trying to help before, just get over it, it's a few years ago. Like cognitively, they want to get over it, but the body's holding on to it, the brain's stuck in a loop sometimes, because it's trying to look after them.
So the question I was going to ask, Paul, do you think the majority of people, most people, at some point have experienced trauma?
Yeah, definitely. I think everything's trauma. The more I've kind of put on me trauma spectacles, everything's trauma. Yeah, definitely.
That's what made me ask the question, because I believe that too. I think most people at some point in their lives have experienced some level of trauma, but the difference is, which is what you've already mentioned around, how it's processed, and I think that also depends on what's going on for that particular person, that particular time in their life. If they're already stressed, if they've already got things going on, then another event can just be too much. It can just overload the brain almost, and
definitely.
That's what develops then into more complex trauma.
And I think with that, it's about the great thing about counselling is that you can be yourself, isn't it? You can work with that kind of part of yourself. There's a therapy called internal family systems, and they talk about different parts of self. And sometimes there's a part of yourself which is so traumatised it becomes in exile, where nobody gets near it, and you become a protector and a manager, and you keep people away from it. But actually coming to therapy and working with that traumatised part of yourself is amazing. It's amazing.
I can imagine that to be fascinating to work with, to work in that way for the client, and of course yourself as well as a therapist as well.
I think even in counselling, I think that we get to that part where it's in counselling called the organismic self, the true self, and it's kind of listening for that voice, that kind of exile part that people shut down, that people didn't hear. Very powerful. We're all very passionate, aren't we, about this?
Oh indeed, so just I keep saying, just before we get into the treatment, because I'm fascinated with great conversation, kind of a segue really in some ways to talking about the treatment modalities for trauma treatment approaches. When you're talking about how trauma's evolved, I guess, over time, and the understanding of trauma and the treatment of trauma, I remember a course I did on trauma with a guy. In fact, you kindly recommended this guy to me, Dr. Gentry, Eric Gentry his name is, and he's kind of a trauma bigwig, brilliant guy, and he said that the 20th century treatment for trauma was kind of his way of, I guess, to put it in a box, if you like. 20th century treatment for trauma was you drag somebody back to that traumatic event and you'd ask them to relive it essentially in the therapy room, of course, and in a safe way, but you'd ask them to relive it and put it back together. And he says that now, more so nowadays, we're actually saying trauma is about reigniting like positive expectancy in your present self. It comes back to that word again, but being more present, and it would only really be if something is having flashbacks. So I guess the Manchester bomb would be a good example. If somebody is experiencing flashbacks and all of those criteria, the diagnostic criteria you went through before, intrusive thoughts and experience, that sort of thing, it would only be if someone's really experiencing that you'd go back and relive the trauma in some ways, or add narrative to the trauma. He says more so nowadays we're looking at actually connecting to your future self rather than reliving your past events. And I just wondered where you were with that, what your take on that is.
Yeah, a big fan of Eric Gentry, big fan. Disagree in some ways.
I do as well with that, and I agree. Sorry to interrupt you, but I agree with what you're saying. I love him, but I didn't sit well with me that.
Because it doesn't have to just be flashbacks. You can be working on a sense of self, because all that is connected to the past. You know, if you look at the palm of your hand, you've got a core memory, and then you know you could work on that core memory and that could be gone, but you've got all these fingers, all these offshoots of other memories about you started to feel about yourself. They're going to need some work too. And it's not about pressing forward because one of the traumas is gone. It's about clearing those pathways until they're ready. In EMDR, we call it adaptive information processing. What the brain does, it forgets all the good stuff that was around at the time and just remembers the bad stuff. So it's about getting that balance up. Not about going forward, about actually the good stuff they were doing back then. Right. You know, I keep on going back to Manchester Bomb just because it's today. You know, the people running out, I was terrified I should have done more, but you know, what happened on the way out? I picked somebody up. Okay, and you pick somebody up while a bomb had gone off. You know, to remind them of those things, actually, yeah, you were doing good things back there then too. And I think that it comes to a point when if you've cleared a lot of the trauma and you feel okay, you have to build into that future self. Okay, so how would you like to respond differently? That's something we can do in EMDR as well. But in counselling as well, it's kind of that relapse prevention, isn't it? We come to the end of counselling. So what's going to happen next time this happens?
Yeah, it's a little bit like the analogy that I often use with people around sort of if you've got weeds in your garden, you can go around and cut the weeds off and your garden will look nice, but in 3-4 months time those weeds will grow back up. I mean, what you need to really do, or what's going to be probably long term the most helpful, which takes a bit more work, is to dig down to the root of those weeds, get the root out, you know, tidy it up, put the soil back on, get it nice, and then those weeds won't come back through. It takes a bit more work, but long term, you know, you're going to benefit from that longer. Otherwise, every 6 months you're going to have to come out and take all the weeds off. That's the kind of analogy that I
It's a great idea.
Yeah, I love that analogy.
And you can both have them.
Yeah, I love that.
Thanks. So you mentioned EMDR then, we've mentioned it a few times, but you said before, remind us again, what does it stand for?
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
I nearly got him that time.
I had to pause a minute, access it.
Yeah. So if it's okay, can we come on to that? So that's something you're trained in. You're an EMDR therapist, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How does that treat trauma? What does that do, if you like, to trauma, and what does that involve?
You know, succinctly, I'd say to a client, what it does, it makes a past trauma a normal memory. You know, we can all remember stuff in the past and it doesn't bother us, but then sometimes a PTSD is a memory that just won't go away, keeps on looping, keeps on coming back, and EMDR helps you to put that back. Doesn't change the memory, but helps it sit differently. You don't get the somatic feelings, it kind of doesn't trouble you, it doesn't bleed into your daily life. So I'm guessing you're asking how?
Excuse me, yeah. Sorry, I'm just having a drink of water. Yeah, so I guess how does it do that? Because that sounds magic, really, in many ways, doesn't it? I guess if someone's experiencing, you know, trauma and
I would say
magic to that process. But how does it do that?
I was really sceptical when I trained in it, and my clients are, and all of the clients are. It sounds like a load of rubbish. It sounds like a bit of a magic thinking. So it's thinking about the brain. As we're growing in the womb, the brain develops, you know, your spine develops first, and then the lower part of your brain, which is the reptilian brain, back to the next part that grows, that looks after all of your bodily functions, breathing, regulation. The next part that grows is the emotional brain, the limbic system, and this is how it develops in the womb. And that's your sense of belonging, your sense of purpose, you know, your pleasure and your fear centre.
Yeah.
And then kind of the neocortex grows, and the front of your brain, that keeps on growing up to the age of 24. And actually that's how the brain grows, and that's how the brain processes trauma as well. So quite often, no amount of talking therapy sometimes can shift trauma. It has to take a long time. Now, when people for a long time just talking therapy, and it has healed the trauma. So you've got the trauma held in the emotional brain and the reptilian brain system, and they really work closely with each other. When a fear happens, contacts the reptilian brain, you get everything into your body that you need. Okay. And your thinking brain is going, what the hell's going on? I shouldn't be feeling like this.
Is that where that I guess that's the point where you mentioned before about often
I suppose we all can, but you mentioned clients that can have that sense of it doesn't make sense because why am I reacting like this when there's nothing going on? Is that the stage where your thinking brain it doesn't make sense to your thinking brain the way your body's reacting?
Yeah, I'm going mad. Okay. I'm going mad. I shouldn't be feeling this way. This happened years ago. Why has it come back now? And why when I've seen something on television, why has that come back now? That happened years ago. But the brain's look for something. The kind of the limbic system is looking for danger, looking for signs always. Like when you step off a curb sometimes and you just stop because you know there's a car coming but you haven't seen it. That part of your brain just takes over and stops you. And it's the same with PTSD. Sometimes it'll see a trigger and it'll just go in that moment.
Okay.
So when you're talking to somebody, there's the thinking part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain, and the trauma and the thinking are in two different parts. So it takes a long time to connect. And with the EMDR, what we're doing is we force them to think about the memory. That'd be really bad, wouldn't it? We say, okay, the memory is coming back anyway, so let's work on it. Yeah. It's scary, it's coming back. So you bring it into the thinking part of the brain, the short-term memory. Ask them what they're feeling about it in the moment. So it invokes the memory, thinking about it, invokes the somatic feelings, and then what you do is say, okay, let's process that. And what you're doing there is you're pulling it into a short-term memory, and it's almost like getting a hard drive on a new computer and trying to put it on a floppy disk.
Right.
It just can't hold the information.
Yeah.
So what it does, it files it, because it can't hold it in the short-term memory. It can't hold the emotional charge. It can't hold the memory. So it has to file it.
Okay.
Any questions around that? I don't know. It sounds like
I mean, I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think so. I suppose before you get to that stage, though, I'm presuming that with a client, you get them to a place where they're able to feel safe.
Yeah.
And grounded within themselves, which we've sort of touched on.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'd imagine that's a big part of certainly the start of the EMDR, to get the person in a set where they feel safe enough to be able to do this work. It still might be quite frightening for them and even overwhelming, but also there's a sense of feeling safe.
Yeah, definitely. It's 8 phases EMDR, and maybe I should have slowed it down a little bit and said that there's 8 phases to it. And I won't go through the 8 phases, but it's due to Herman's model. There's the grounding and stabilisation, then there's the reprocessing or narrative work, and then there's the future work. So we kind of we do a lot of talking first. Maybe, I work in the NHS, so it's like 6 sessions, but ideally you need to go 3 or 4 sessions first to talk about what's happened, and then get them to regulate and give them homework. And it will be kind of safe space work, creating a space where they don't feel the trauma.
Okay.
There's a technique called light stream where you can kind of dissipate some feelings of stress. There's container work where you get the clients something to put the trauma in so it doesn't jump out between sessions. And when they feel safe enough, that's when you start the processing work.
So that's crucial then, isn't it? The safety and stabilisation.
Definitely, yeah. You can't do anything else. Some people can't tolerate it, some people can't. That's where you kind of gauge it. Are they right for this? Can they get better? Can they get worse before they get better? Because some people's stress bucket is completely full, and what you're trying to do is empty that a bit. But kind of really important, have they got the potential to get, especially with trauma, the potential to get worse before they get better.
And that's why sometimes, because I tend to use the Herman model of trauma when I'm working with trauma, is that phase 1 or stage 1 of that safety and grounding. Sometimes for some people that's all that they're able to do at that point, and then they maybe need to go away, spend a bit more time on focusing on that before they're ready to go to stage 2, which then could be in your case EMDR, or I know you've mentioned Brainspotting, or whether that CBT, trauma focus
work and stuff.
So what my understanding of it is, and the way I try and work is, if you don't do phase 1, then phase 2 is not going to have the same effect. You need to get phase 1, which is the safety and grounds, and to the point where then you're ready to then move on to stage.
Because they've got to have that sense of control back, haven't they, before they start that stuff.
I think that's the crucial thing, isn't it? It's like you kind of, it's, to put it, I suppose, in a very, very simple description, like your self-belief has got to come back, that you can actually do things for yourself, and because stabilise yourself.
The hard work is sometimes, especially with complex PTSD, is that some people have never felt safe, and feeling safe is terrifying. So when you're doing the grounding work, that's really difficult, because that's a block too. Because I've never felt safe, I've always had to be on alert. And so you have to work quite creatively with that sometimes.
Yeah. And I would guess as well, and it does resonate in some ways, although of course I'm not as specialised as your good self around trauma, working with clients with anxiety disorders, or, you know, I suppose all areas really of mental health. Clients presenting to sessions with depression, anxiety, social anxiety, whatever it may be, OCD as well. That is, I think, can be such a huge step for the therapy sessions, you know, for the person, just actually feeling like I can have at least some time in my day where I'm not really self-critical, or I'm not, you know, overwhelmed with anxiety, overwhelmed with worry, constantly on guard, constantly with my defences up. That can be such a turning point, you know, just actually getting to that stage, I think. And
giving them that technique to go away with and do that themselves. But actually, as the EMDR starts, it's about keeping them, kind of when we get into the processing stuff, when we get into the eye movement and those kind of things. Just going back to what I was saying before, is when we're working with the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, it's about the limbic system's in the past, and the neocortex, the thinking brain's in the present. And as a therapist, you have to keep that one foot in each, because sometimes they can be disassociated and drift into that memory so far. So you've really got to keep them present. So it's keeping one foot in the thinking brain to help that trauma process, and one foot in the past. So it's about reminding the client that you're there, you're with them, they're not by themselves. It's an old memory. The brain's trying to heal. It's like taking a splinter out of a wound. You know, if you've got a cut, you leave a splinter in, it's never going to heal. This is about taking that splinter out, that thing that's stuck, to kind of move them forward. And with the eye movements, they're not quite sure how it works. Sometimes we tap, kind of bilateral on your knees, or butterfly hug, so your hands on each side. Eye movements where clients will follow your fingers, and they reckon it's like REM sleep. So when you're in REM sleep, your eyes are moving, and they say that's when you're processing your memories, that's when you're processing your day. Sometimes you go to bed and you'll go, just can't get this problem out of my head. You doze off and you wake up in the morning. It's different because you've had time to process it. So it's almost like manually filing this memory where it needs to be. And you're looking for shifts, you're looking for a shift in feelings, bodily feelings, you're looking for a shift in the memory. And you can't predict it, you can't predict what's going to happen. Sometimes clients are, it's like it's behind a frosty window now, or, you know, I've got a bit more distance from it. My adult self has come in sometimes. An adult self will just turn up, or a protector, and change the memory. Someone who was working with recently, actually someone came in and they took a door off. They took the door off the room that they were traumatised in, and they destroyed the door, and that part of themselves could leave. And then when you come back the next week, you say, okay, well, what's it like this week? Well, door's off now, so I'm not there anymore.
Just feels a bit different.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Sounds very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when you were talking then about sort of, you know, with not quite being quite sure with their eyes sort of moving and stuff, how it works, I think I do, not so much with trauma, very, very rarely with trauma, but if I'm doing hypnotherapy, it's the similar type of process, obviously slightly different, but when you start to look at making the change that the person wants to make, one of the things you sort of notice is sort of the eye movements changes, but also I've done some rewind technique as well, and it's that can be similar also.
It's like it's a little bit of Brainspotting stuff. It's kind of where your look affects how you feel. You know, even if you thought about something, if someone was listening now and they thought about something that's mildly disturbing, and just move their eyes and see how that somatic feeling changes to them. It's like when you ask somebody, what colour's your front door, and what was your first school? They're looking to different places. They're manually looking with their eyes.
So you've mentioned Brainspotting to us before, you know, obviously earlier on in this episode, but in the past to myself, and I know it's fascinating because I don't know too much about it. Can you just give us a bit of an overview? What is Brainspotting? What does it involve? And what would Brainspotting be suitable for? What would you say?
I'm trained to level 2 in Brainspotting. I haven't done my level 3, which is
Okay.
like the qualification level. I think it's suitable for anything, absolutely anything.
Is
Trauma,
it's a trauma
trauma,
treatment?
yeah, trauma treatment, performance treatment, sports performance. It's amazing.
Okay.
It's really
Wow.
incredible to watch. You know, it needs, you know, they're getting it in place, and I think it needs a lot more research, and there's stuff building up now. You can look online, lots of research about, I forget the name of the place now, but where a gunman went into a school. They went in, wherever there's trauma, Brainspotting therapists just turn up en masse and help out. And they don't wait for the PTSD, they don't wait for that time limit. It's just kind of, let's just work with it. Let's just work with it now. I think that's really ethical actually as well. Let's just do some work on it if it needs it.
So what's it involve?
So the guy who kind of brought it around, David Grand, he was an EMDR therapist for years, and he was working with an ice skater, and she couldn't do a triple spin. She was a young person, and they were working on EMDR for ages, and he couldn't get anywhere. And he just noticed one day that an eye wobbled at one part, and he said, "Okay, let's just hold it there. Instead of moving your eye side to side, let's just hold it there." Next thing she said, "Oh, I feel something down my throat. I can't speak." And then she remembers, she got took back to a memory of her mum shouting at her when she was about 2 by saying, "You'll never do anything, you'll never be any good, you'll never get anywhere." At the end of the session, you were like, "What was that about?" And I really don't know what that's about. The next day, she rang him back and said, "I've done the triple spin and I can do it anytime." So it unlocks something. And the theory behind Brainspotting is that there's certain parts of your brain where the trauma gets stuck and it almost digs its claws in. It's almost like if you imagine something being held like a pill, and it digs its claws into the brain. With Brainspotting, it's like a laser focus, kind of where that trauma's held, and it just allows it to dissolve and process. Absolutely fascinating.
So you kind of do you relive it? Do you go through that memory again with the client?
It's really profound. It's really oddly profound. I volunteered to get up at Manchester when we did it. We trained. I thought, I'll get up and have a go. It was just such an experience. It was just really profound. So what you do, you have like the outside window. There's me looking in. As I move, you use a wand and you move the wand, and the client's eyes follow. And you're looking for differences. You're looking for shakes in the eyes, jaw changes, breathing changes. That indicates that there's something. I'm outside looking in, there's something going on inside. Or it can be the other way around. The client can say, "I'll do it," and they'll tell you where it feels worse. Okay. So you bring it up the memory. Where are you feeling now? So I went up with not feeling good enough around professionals because of my childhood, not being clever in school, always being called thick. So I got up with that. So okay, let's work on that. Found it. And then it took me into a whole thing with my dad, not feeling good enough with my dad. So it wasn't about what was presenting, it was kind of really this other stuff. And then kind of, you can't predict where it's going to go. Once you allow the brain to heal, it will just go where it needs to go, and you just trust it. So for me, wanted to work on not feeling good enough in work, around the professionals, took me to my dad's bereavement. Actually coming out of that, feeling fine about work and being okay around other professionals. I don't know what went on.
So you found it really effective, really productive? Yeah?
That was one session.
Really?
That was one session, yeah. One session, about 50 minutes. Really odd experience. Really being held by the guy who was doing Brainspotting with me. Really felt safe, attuned. Quite hard to quantify Brainspotting, I think, anyway. Quite hard to quantify.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? And it just comes back to that, which, you know, is quite a word used a lot in therapy, isn't it? Is like trusting that process. But once you've experienced it, once you've done it, and you know it works, you might know some of the theory, but you don't quite know how it works. Yeah. But you know it works. It's then about just trusting that process, isn't it? I think a lot of the time, well, for me anyway. Yeah,
it's about learning it and going with it and trusting it. And I think there's something about, especially when I'm doing a bit of I do a bit of teaching. Sometimes you will only go to the depth. You, as a counsellor, you will only take a client to the depth that you've been to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. 100%.
So it's about going there, otherwise you're going to block it. You're going to block that process.
Yeah.
And getting that sense of there's nowhere I can go with this counsellor that they can't hold me in that place.
Yeah.
And you as a counsellor trusting yourself to do that.
Yeah. 100%.
Without pushing yourself into kind of unethical boundaries, you know, because you know, there's times when we all say, actually, I might not be the right person for you. It's just being
I think that's a crucial factor, isn't it, in this world, and particularly as a therapist, is that self-awareness to say, as you say, someone might be more suitable for you than me, or a different modality might be more appropriate for you. I think that's a really, really key, a key skill in therapy. So, as we've said, I could sit here all day and enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, it's been good, I've enjoyed it.
And I'm sure that there's loads that you've not, even the stuff we've talked about, we could expand on a lot more and go in a lot more detail. And, if people are interested and want us to, I'm sure, hopefully you've enjoyed this experience. If people want to talk more about the EMDR, we could come back and go into a bit more depth about it. But it's
I mean, in other areas of, obviously you said at the beginning, you're different, all the qualifications you've got, Paul, and different and also the different client bases, shall we say, that you worked in. You mentioned working in university as well. I'd be interested to hear working with students and what that demographic's like. And
he doesn't know it yet, but he's going to become our resident guest.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. You're the house guest now. But I just thought, just before we kind of come towards the end, you mentioned the rewind technique. We've mentioned that a few times as well. Could you just give us a kind of brief of what that is, what that involves, please?
Again, really quite sceptical doing the rewind training, but it's normally for single event trauma. I know that they're doing a lot of stuff with the NHS at the moment with the staff who've got PTSD. And it's just targeting a specific trauma, and as you say, you're reliving it. Do you want me to go into it a little bit and talk about it, or have we got time?
Yeah, we've got time.
To put it briefly, you reimagine the event. So the way you sell it to a client is, if you're on a roller coaster, what would you be feeling? Oh, my stomach would be going, my wind, the wind would be blowing in my face, I'd be feeling a little bit sick. Okay, but if you come off that roller coaster, what would you be watching? What would it be like to watch yourself? Oh, I could remember what it was like, but I wouldn't be feeling it as much. So that's what you do with the trauma, because they're reliving it, they're feeling those things. You help them to separate from it and watch it back.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you imagine being in a cinema, and you allow the film to play back, and there's lots of other nuances to this, but you allow the film to play back as they're watching it. And then at the end of the trauma, you don't miss out any important bits. You actually enter the film again. You enter the film at the point it ends, and then pull yourself back as fast as you can through the whole video. Okay. So you watch it first, everything going on, everything that happened, watching it as an outsider. Then you go in it and imagine the film just being rewound. So if there was a building falling down, you wouldn't see every brick falling down. The bricks would just go back into place. And you start in a safe space and end in a safe space.
Yeah.
Watch it, get to the end, in it, and pull yourself out of it. And it's really interesting what it does. The PTSD scale got some amazing results. There's a document called the PCL5, an outcome measure. Anything over 32 shows PTSD. So people who've got 65, scoring like really significant PTSD. After one rewind session, they're scoring like 10s, 5s, 10s, and it can be that effective, And it's really got some strong evidence. It's getting a strong evidence base, and maybe in the NHS soon.
Yeah, I've used it a couple of times, and it's quite. It can be quite, as you say, effective. It can be, and there's a bit more to it as well, isn't it? When you're doing it with a client, about if it's something that's really distressing them, you can do things like. Take the colour out of it and put a frame around it, make it black and white, turn the volume down and the brightness and things like that, and then as you go through the process you change it, but yeah, it's quite a good technique to use. I suppose with all of these, the EMDR, rewind, CBT, and Brainspotting, I suppose the key is about finding what works best for the client, doesn't it? Which is for me always the key about finding what works best for the client, because although our brains all work in the same way, they can also work very differently in a lot of ways as well also.
And it's where the client is at that stage in their life when they come to therapy, isn't it, as well, which, no, I couldn't agree more. It's what's suitable for you. Sorry, Paul.
No, I was just going to say, it's also gauging it as well. You know, it's like Jaws, isn't it, when he says, you know, they go out there to catch this shark and they're like, we're going to need the bigger boat, and they wrecks the boat.
Yeah.
What you don't want to do is try, you know, you need the right stabilisation and therapy to land that shark.
Yeah.
And the right techniques to be able to cut it loose. This is going to be too much for this session. It's going to be too much for this client, having tools to cut that loose.
And is that where the brings us back to the beginning of this conversation? Re-traumatising the client can be a really, you know, don't run that risk. Is that, am I understanding what you're saying there? Make sure you have the tools to be able to close it down if necessary. And
that's what was really important about Brian before. Brian had noticed that I'd gone straight into talking about the processing work, and now he's actually you need that grounding work first.
And I think for me, again, the biggest part about being a therapist is recognising your limits and when you can help someone and when you can't. When clients contact me and say, can you help deal with this, you know what I always say to them is, well, you know, come along, have a chat, and I'll see if I can try and help, because I might not be the right person, and I might not have the right skill set to help that particular person, and that's not that person's fault. It's my skill base, and it's about being able to then be confident enough to say, look, I think what you're bringing here is something that I'm not experienced to work with, and that's what I like about, you know, even ourselves. You know, I can then say, well, you know, I maybe know somebody who does EMDR, who I can refer you to, although you're really busy at the moment, Paul.
In demand. Certainly, yeah, and as we mentioned that before, didn't we? The having the I guess the professionalism, but also just the being ethical and self-aware enough to say somebody else may be more suitable, or another modality may be more suitable. Again, it's important for us to say, if anybody listening is wanting to access therapy, or maybe accessing therapy at the moment, talking about all these different techniques and all different modalities of trauma, if we are feeling like this isn't working for them, or they're not comfortable, you know, ask for the credentials of a therapist when you're accessing therapy. That's crucial. That's a big disclaimer from us as well. You know, everything we've discussed today is not to kind of go away and try this at home sort of thing. It's as you say in there, Brian, it's very much like, make sure you're getting the right therapist, and that they're qualified, and that they have, you know, the necessary credentials to be delivering what they're...
Yeah, because some of the things that I've mentioned today do have robust guidelines in place for who can train in it, but some of them don't.
Yeah, right, okay.
You know, so make sure that a qualified therapist, definitely, at least to level 4 in counselling, at least.
At minimum. And check that, for me, I know a bit contentious for some people, but check that they're registered with regulated bodies as well, because if anything goes wrong, that's as a client who you can go to say, I've seen this person and this happened. So I'd always, for me anyway, suggest, you know, going with somebody who's a member of a regulated body, and ask about the qualifications and their experience. Don't you know, just because they have a title of a therapist or a counsellor, just double check what their qualifications are.
And again, it's a whole massive other conversation, isn't it? But there's lots of people that have been put off therapy because they haven't got what they needed.
From bad
experience, definitely.
And that's definitely going to be an episode at some point, I think. But I'm just aware of the time, and as we said, we could go on all day and talk about it, because it's a fascinating subject that I know we're all really passionate and interested about. So just sort of the last two things, really, I suppose, is firstly, is there anything else, Paul, that you want to say, or that you feel like we haven't asked, or you want to mention? Or have we covered everything?
No, I just think, you know, I think we covered everything, but just to say that there is hope. Yeah. There is hope. Even for if you think you're the worst case or the worst, no one's ever been either like you, there is hope.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant message and moral of trauma treatment, really, isn't it? I know I mentioned before about that positive expectancy that Eric Gentry talks about, and I think that's a big part of it, isn't it? That's a fantastic message.
Sometimes as therapists we've got to hold that hope for somebody else to see it. We've got to hold that candle in the darkness.
Yeah, definitely.
You might be that fulcrum, you know, that catalyst for their hope. So it's just, absolutely, there is hope. And were you going to say something else, Paul?
Well, another little thing that we thought would be good to introduce to the podcast, and with us having guests on now as therapists, when clients come, we often they might come for an hour once a week, and then they've got the rest of the week to sort of work through whatever it is that they're working through. So as therapists, we often give clients tasks to do, or homework, as sometimes it can be called, which I don't like the word, but anyway, but certainly tasks, and just some techniques and strategies to use and practice. So what we thought would be good was for when we have a guest on, for them to suggest, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot too much, Paul, but giving us a sort of strategy or a technique that we can go away and practice for every day for a week, and then on our next episode, me and Mark will have a quick chat about how we found it, if we were able to do it, if it helped in any way. And obviously, we're both therapists, so we know a lot of these techniques, and a lot of them we probably have practiced out. Well, I'll practice a lot of techniques, so I won't give somebody something that I haven't tried myself, but just as a bit of sort of interest, really, I think, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. I think it'd be good to link as well to from one episode to the next. It'd be good for you and I to reflect on, because I'm sure there'll be things that I know certainly for myself, there'll be things I'll take away from today that I'll be, next time I speak to Brian, I'm going, do you know, I was thinking about what Paul said, that sort of thing. So it'll be good for us to just as well reflect on a bit of an exercise, if you can think of anything.
And it doesn't have to be actually like trauma informed, it can be, but just something that we can go away, practice every day, and then we can reflect on it next week when we record again about how we found it.
Right, okay. My initial thought is going to do something like a container or something like that, but it's quite a big piece of work, and I don't want people listening to go away and try it by themselves, just in case it does trigger them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But I think what we could do is work on just noticing your stress levels.
Okay.
Yeah, because
good.
We're all stressed.
Mm-hmm.
We just come out of a pandemic. People who are traumatised carry stress all the time, and this is something quite safe to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's just checking in with yourself maybe once a day when you're in work. And it's just really simple.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll do this for clients, especially if they're traumatised and can't access a lot of work. It's just unclenching your jaw and just noticing that, relaxing, and then relaxing your shoulders, and just noticing the difference between that, and just scanning yourself for any other place you need to relax. And after you've done that, it's just moving your eyes side to side 8 times. Right. And you can't see them, but they're doing it now. And then after that, just taking 3 deep belly breaths. And that means letting your stomach come out more than your chest. And actually sometimes I'll tell a client to do that. I don't like doing it because I've got a bit of a belly, but it's just noticing that. And then as you're letting go of that, what I want you to notice is just, the Americans call it your sit bones, but it's the bones of your bum, the bones that you sat on, and your hip bones. And just imagine the line connecting the bones that you sat on to your hip bones, and just consciously relaxing that area. That can be really difficult sometimes. Just consciously letting that go. So unclenching your jaw, relaxing your shoulders, moving your eyes side to side about 8 times.
Moving your what, sorry?
Eyes side to side 8 times. Just moving them side to side without thinking about anything. 3 deep belly breaths, and then relaxing the bones between the hips and what you sat on, so that whole area. And just noticing that, just doing that sometimes, doing that. The hardest part will probably be the bit where you're relaxing the abdomen, because we're not used to letting that go, but that's where we hold a lot of tension. If you let that go, some people feel like they might go to the toilet, but actually you won't. You're just letting go of that tension. And that can be really good for the clients as well.
I felt definitely the relaxing those particular muscles, because it's something I'm not used to doing. Was a bit difficult, but straight away after doing that, I mean, we're already sitting in quite a relaxed environment anyway, but I feel quite grounded and relaxed by doing that. So that's something that we're going to commit to trying to do every day for a week, and then we'll
absolutely
have a bit of a reflect on it. But
sometimes some people like to shake the hands, shake the feet as well, just before doing the belly breath. So just find out what's right for you.
Yeah.
I guess, is that like feeding back to the brain? Is it that it's okay to relax, or am I reading too much into that?
Yeah. And for the kind of the work around trauma, it's that kind of, I think they call it reciprocal inhibition. You can't be tense, you can't be traumatised in a relaxed body, you can't be angry or stressed in a relaxed body. So it's good if you're stressed, it's good if you're angry.
Yeah, or anxious.
Yeah, or anxious.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's called interoception. That.
Yeah.
I think that's what it's called. You can't be traumatised in a relaxed body. It's like the interoception process.
Yeah.
We will do that this week. So
we will.
Every day this week, and we'll feed back on our next episode.
So, thanks very much for coming, Paul.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely brilliant. That was thoroughly enjoyable. Thanks, Paul.
Our very first guest on the Therapy Shed podcast.
Yeah.
Hopefully many more. Yeah, good. And I think that's a wrap.
See you next time.
That was good. Enjoyed.
Once I get on your head, it flowed quite well, didn't it?
Yeah,
It flowed quite well. I like some of the input as well. It's just remembering that pitching, isn't it? Trying to pitch at the right level.
That's it. You don't want to be too thingy, but you don't want to be... Yeah, it is definitely.
And I guess when you're offering information